Welcome to another episode of Accidental Landlord. I'm your host, Peter McKenzie, and today we are talking about the sharing economy. So everybody, for the most part, knows the sharing economy, the gig economy. It's called a lot of different things. Think Uber, DoorDash, things like that. This is affecting rental properties. Shocker. I'm sure everybody knows that. I mean, this is nothing new or revolutionary, but we wanted to just do an episode that talks about how it affects landlords. And there's a lot of landlords that are stuck in the past, or they've been a landlord for 20, 30 years and they don't quite understand all this new stuff that's happening or how it's impacting their business. And frankly, it's changed quite a bit. And that's the purpose of this episode. Talk about what this looks like, what it means for landlords, what it means for tenants, those types of things. So and real estate is not alone. I mean, it's revolutionized a lot of different sectors. Like, look at taxi cabs. Taxi cabs are, pretty much almost on the brink of being out of business from Uber and Lyft and things like that. So as far as platforms in the real estate rental space, there's clearly things like Airbnb, VRBO, HomeAway, Furnished Finders. There's all these companies that pop up. There's also companies that rent by the room, and they do a similar model that way as well. There's all these things that come up that change the game for us. So we want to talk about it. It's not all good. It's not all bad. Some of it provides an incredible amount of flexibility for landlords and tenants. It gives you the option to earn different kinds of income. Some things you can make way more than a long-term rental, but there's trade-offs. There's things that go along with that. And we're going to get into what the implications of some of those things are, and try to take more of a global view of it and not just what it means for me in this one property. So let's get started. Let's explore those topics and see where this goes. So this stuff is causing a disruption of a traditional rental model. The traditional rental model is you have a property, you rent it out to someone on a long-term basis, you sign a lease or a month-to-month agreement, and they stay there hopefully for a long time. And you raise the rent a little bit every year, maybe. A lot of landlords don't. And that's been it for, a lot of years. It's usually unfurnished. Tenant brings their own furniture, and the landlord doesn't really get involved in anything other than maybe fixing things when they break and collecting rent. That's the old way, and that still happens, clearly. Like, this is not going away by any means, but there are alternatives to that traditional model. One of the, the main alternatives that most people know about is short-term rentals, or putting your house on Airbnb, VRBO. Those are all what we call short-term models. And they are having an impact on the long-term model, because people figured out that I can make a higher return, i.e. I can collect more in rent on the same property without having to do a whole lot more. Why would I rent long-term? So it's disrupting the model. Now, there's more to it than that, and we're going to get into that. But the potential for higher returns is causing a lot of people to experiment and go that route. Which is reducing the availability of long-term rental units, which, guess what, is exasperating our housing shortage, angering local cities and municipalities, causing them to turn around and do more regulatory stuff. And it's not just that we're losing the units. There's other stuff that goes along with it, like, disruption of neighborhoods, changing the makeup of the neighborhood, those types of things. All this is leading towards increased competition for what the property is going to be used for. So there's short term, which is one category, generally considered 30 days or less, furnished for the most part, and you go through, you pay more in a way you would pay for like a hotel or something along those lines. Then you have midterm rentals. Midterm rentals are generally considered like 3 to 6 months. They're usually furnished, and they're usually targeted towards professionals, whether they're medical people, if it's close to a hospital, or traveling executives, people that are being brought in for particular work issues. Depends, if you live near a large employer, this is more common close to where the headquarters is, that type of thing. That also gives you an opportunity for higher income with a trade-off. It's usually more work as well, but that is disrupting the traditional long-term model as well. So all of this is impacting the tenant expectations. So they expect things to be done quicker, on demand. They expect flexibility, They have options where they don't just have to rent your one apartment. They can rent a room. They can rent the property for a week, a month, a year. Just a lot of options for tenants, which some would argue is good for tenants to have the optionality when it comes to where they're going to live or how they're going to travel. How can landlords respond to this? Well, you as a landlord have to analyze your strategy. It's no longer just traditional long-term. You now have options available to you, and you need to be flexible. You need to educate yourself on what those options are and figure out what works best for you. Some people will no doubt choose to stay long-term because they're comfortable with it. It's the model that requires the least amount of effort from a landlord. And a lot of people will choose to go short-term because it has the highest revenue options out there. This is not a episode to beat up on short-term rentals, because the short-term rental game has changed as well. When we were in the middle of COVID-19, short-term rentals were, especially in areas that weren't necessarily locked down, like a lot of the south, middle of the country, where you could go and not wear a mask and, eat at a restaurant. Short-term rentals in those areas went absolutely wild. And the amount of money you could make on a short-term rental was mind-blowing. And people started flocking to those areas to buy short-term rentals. Well, things changed once the pandemic was over. People didn't travel as much. You had areas, I know specifically in Idaho where we have some property. There was immediately a shortage of an oversupply of short-term rentals, and you saw occupancy rates plummeting, their daily average rates plummeting, and you had a lot of people who were in trouble because people were buying these things on the premise that they were going to have this demand for them forever, and the reality was they weren't. It was artificially caused by COVID-19. So that is something that you have to factor in when you're going to do short-term rental game. Is there something that's going to consistently draw people to your area so that you can support the expectations that you set for that property? The other thing that needs to be considered when we're talking about these different strategies is the regulatory challenges that come along with them and how to stay compliant. So we're in California. Just for the traditional long-term model, we're being inundated with regulatory issues. So whether it's a city passing an ordinance, the state passing a law, the federal government passing a law, the county you're in, there's all these entities that are passing laws that affect just the traditional long-term model. So that's one thing. On the other side of the token, you have short-term model. And short-term rentals have been like the target of cities for a while now. And they literally are passing as many rules and regulations as they can to regulate this. Frankly, I feel like the cities don't like the short-term rentals because, which in my mind is mind-blowing because they're bringing tourism into the city, people who spend money, and that's all good for the city. Yet the neighborhoods are changing. The neighbors in the neighborhoods are usually upset. They're complaining. They're lobbying their city councils or whoever's making the laws in their area to make laws to regulate what you can do with the house, which in general I think is not the best thing. We want to preserve property rights, not take property rights away from people. But there's a balance. There are some short-term operators who probably were being inconsiderate in the way they ran their business. And then, of course, there were people who probably were being very considerate. But the reality is that is probably more regulated than the long-term market. And that's a consideration. It's a factor. If you buy a short-term rental with the plan to short-term rental it out, and then all of a sudden the city says, guess what, you can't short-term rental here, well, that's going to be a big problem. So our advice, and I think most investors will say, you have a couple different strategies for the same property. If this all goes well, I'm going to do short-term. If short-term doesn't work out and they pass a law against it, I'm going to fall back on long-term or mid-term or something along those lines. You can't just have one thing that's going to work, which goes back to you have to buy the property right so that you have room to pivot and make other strategies work. But regulatory challenges is a big problem for short-term rentals. It's also a big problem for long-term rentals. So this one kind of applies across the board. Impacts on property values. So this we see in areas that had people flood to them during COVID-19. The property values shot up. And then once all those people dried up, the property values shot down. So whereas some of the areas of the country had didn't see a big dip in valley, peak in valley with price related to this. The areas that did have this happen, the only one I have personal experience with is Idaho. You saw prices skyrocket and then prices came down. I don't want to say they crashed, but they definitely came down faster than the rest of the country. So you have to consider that as an impact. The other thing that impacts property values is the amount of regulation. So if you, for example, are in California and you own multifamily property and you're controlled by these statewide rent control laws, which you are for the most part, there's obviously some exceptions for certain types of properties. How much you can raise the rent for directly impacts the value of the property, because in the multifamily world, the properties are judged on their cap rate and how much net operating income they have. And if you can't raise the rents, because the laws are preventing you and the person who owned it before you didn't raise the rents like they should have, then that regulation is severely impacting the value of your property. Something to keep in mind for sure when it comes to how all this regulation affects your bottom line. Okay, so I think that was the general overview of what the options are. You got long-term, short-term, mid-term. Let's talk about the operational considerations, because there's always a trade-off. There's nothing free in this world, right? Like there's no magic strategy that we're all going to get rich off of. If there was, everybody would be doing it and then it wouldn't work, right? So the operational considerations for these strategies are this. Short-term rentals require the most amount of work. You're basically operating a hotel. You're very customer service facing and oriented, and it's a job, for lack of a better term. If you have one or two or three of these things, it's a job to do it well. And there are options. You could hire a short-term management company, which typically don't have the best reputation, and that business lives and dies by its reviews. So if you have an owner operator who's doing it, they generally can provide a better experience than a realtor who's trying to do it on the side. So operationally, you're working harder for that money, which translates into you have a job. And there's a lot of people that don't have the time to have a second job. Like you have a full-time career doing whatever it is that, provides money for your family. You can't just all of a sudden open up a second business running short-term rentals. So there's something to consider there. Some people do have the time and it's a strategy that works well for them. But you need to know that you can't just go straight into, oh, they make 40% more, I'm going to do that, and not weigh what actually goes into that. And in the end, it's a lot more work. Midterms, a little bit less than short term, but still work because the properties are furnished. You still provide things like, some cleaning services, some utilities, and then the properties turn over more frequently. They're not turning over every single weekend like a short term might, but they might turn over every couple of months. Again, more work from you as the landlord, but less work than a short term. And then the final one is the long-term strategy, which everybody knows, which has been the traditional way for a long time. And that is, I would say, potentially the least amount of work. Also the easiest to kind of offload because there are plenty of management companies that can do it for you. Arguably some good, some bad. But if you did it yourself, you're not turning your property over every couple months. You're hopefully turning your property over every couple of years, and hopefully you're screening your tenants and you're finding good tenants and they're taking care of the property. That's long-term. Just so happens to be that long-term also offers the lowest income potential. So you see the trade-off. Less work, less money, more work, more money, more headache. So I hope that makes sense. Now, there are strategies that you can use to mitigate some of this operational workload. Like there are plenty of softwares. You can develop systems for bookings and payments and communications. There's all kinds of stuff out there. Then that's not the purpose of this episode. This is more of a general overview. But if you wanted to make your life easier, if you were doing short term, there's plenty of options for that. Doesn't mean it's going to be without work. It just means some of the work will be easier for you and more streamlined. Certain things like local market dynamics and events and things like that affect these strategies as well. If you're in a short-term market and you have like a national event that comes to your area once a year, that obviously has a big impact that might make doing a short-term strategy more desirable during certain times of the years. And there are areas that will short-term their property out during their like popular season and then do a mid/long-term for the 6 to 8 months that it's not so popular. So different areas have different considerations that affect these different strategies. Obviously, if you're thinking about doing this, you're going to need to do a ton of research to figure out what the best thing is in your area, or what kind of hybrid approach, or what works the best. Because there's a strategy that works in every single market. It doesn't matter if you're in a market where a house is $5 million, or you're in a market where there's houses for $200,000. There is a strategy that works in all of those markets. Last thing, or one of the last things, is the impact to the community or the neighborhood. So these strategies all impact neighborhoods differently. So short-term rentals, arguably probably have the highest negative impact on areas. And this is what generally is the start of where these laws come from. You get a bunch of neighbors who are really upset at the parties that are going on, or the traffic that's happening, or the 15 cars that are parked at the short-term rental on your block. So you have to be mindful of what strategy you're going to pick and how it's going to affect the neighborhood. And sometimes you want to buy properly to mitigate some of those issues. So if you know you're going to do a rent by the room strategy, probably not a good idea to buy a property in an HOA with limited parking and strict parking enforcement. You might want to buy a property where there's a bigger garage, a long driveway, somewhere you can mitigate some of the issues surrounding that. So that just goes to doing your research and thinking ahead a few steps to save yourself the headache from some of these strategies. And finally, we want to talk about technology. So obviously, most of these sharing economy type things are driven by technology. I mean, it's most of these companies have some technology that disrupts. The app that Uber created changed the whole game for taxi cabs, or the way, you can show rental properties in a self-showing manner, which we happen to use in one of our companies, that changed the way people looked at rental properties for the better. So technology usually drives this stuff, whether you're going to manage these things on your own, whether it's short, mid, or long term. There's platforms that are available to you that help you do that. I don't think there's any magic software that does everything for you. You still have to be involved and aware as an investor and owner of these properties, but there's a lot of solutions out there that make them a lot easier. Smart home technologies being one of them. Like, you can open and close doors, turn on and off lights. Like, there's a lot of things that are out there that are pretty cool that make your job a lot easier. But you have to just stay on top of these things. It's not terribly difficult to do, but it does take some work. In my opinion, you shouldn't pick a strategy and then set it and forget it for 20 years. You should always kind of stay on top of what's going on and stay ahead of the curve so you have the best opportunity for having a successful investment. So in conclusion, this is just a general overview talking about the different types of options you have out there if you have an investment property. A lot of this supports, flexibility for the owner and for the tenant. You got to stay informed. You got to stay on top of all the regulatory issues. You got to use technology in your business. All of these things can make the lives better of you as the owner of the investment property, of your tenants or your guests that are staying there. And in my opinion, this is a good thing. The face of being an investment property owner has changed. And it's our job to stay on top of it and make sure that we're using the changes to our advantage. If you kind of clam up and go, I don't want anything to change, I don't want to use any technology, you're going to be obsolete in the end. And nobody wants that. I don't think it's good for anybody. So thanks for listening to this episode on just kind of a general overview of what your options are as a landlord or someone who owns an investment property. And hopefully it was helpful.